first question is, in the early 30s, before Joe Louis, before he came around, what kind of press coverage did they have was there for black athletes?
Well, actually, not much. Before Joe Louis, you have to understand that the eminent black outside of Jesse Owens, he was to come along, was Harry Wills, the great heavyweight contender in black, and matter of a record that both Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney refused to fight the black. Actually, it wasn't their preference. They were willing to fight Harry Wills, but promoter Tex Rickard, with his background in race relations, was simply scared of what might develop with black versus white for the heavyweight title, and heaven forbid the black man win. So Harry Wills and all other blacks were excluded. The blacks, as you know, were excluded in baseball. They were simply shoved aside and put aside. And if you speak of coverage of the blacks, there virtually wasn't any until Jesse Owens, I think, first came along behind Louis. Jesse Owens and Joe Louis gave America an awareness, a new awareness of blacks as athletes.
Great, thank you. What was it about, before Harry Wills was, of course, Jack Johnson. What was it about Jack Johnson that made the boxing establishment say never again to a black champion?
I'm not so sure that the American people said never again following the scandals of Jack Johnson, who presented the worst kind of image for the blacks with what his white slavery conditions and his arrogance and all against a background in the years when there was a division of the races, a great division of the races. And as you know, and he knocked out Jim Jeffries in 1910 in Reno, there were riots all over the country, and blacks were lynched and some whites were killed. Shouldn't joke about this. But this stigmatized the blacks as championship contenders. It wasn't going to happen. May I say that aside from Johnson, blacks really had no great future as fighters because all champions were white, and promoters weren't eager to give the black man a chance to fight for the title. And they were reduced to fighting in what they call the undercard, the semifinals, and even less. And I remember speaking to one promoter in Washington, Goldier, and he says, good-looking black fighter. And I says, had a great semifinal fight between two blacks. And or rather, it wasn't a great fight. It was a dull fight. And I say, it was a lousy fight. And he says, yes, he says, they have no incentive for fighting. He says, they know they'll never get a main bout. And so they go in there and they fight a very listless fight. They're not getting hurt. I asked him, well, how do they manage this? They don't know each other. They haven't met each other. How can they say we're going to take it easy in here? And he says, well, blacks having no future in prize fighting, he says, they talk with their eyes. And I have this memory of blacks being doomed to so-called preliminaries and undercards.
Great. So what was it about Joe Louis that changed all that?
Well, let us consider, we probably could say of Joe Louis that he came along probably without realizing it, advancing the cause of race relations, as I say, without knowing it. Because Joe Louis was accepted as what the would call in those times the good Negro. Joe was likable. He was, let's say, illiterate. He could hardly write a name, and he read not at all. But there was no sense of misbehaving, and he was modest, and he was knocking out all these other people, and he bragged, and not at all, boasted on at all, a big contrast with the arrogance of Mike Tyson. And so Joe Louis got an acceptance, I do believe, that no other black athlete ever got. And in his own way, I say, he advanced the cause of race relations probably in a greater degree than anybody before Martin Luther King came along. And I think that this acceptance of Joe Louis by the American people was a watershed or a landmark or whatever you want to call it.
Did the American people accept him at first, or was he first just... did it take the American people a while to accept him, white people? Did it take them a while to accept him?
In the Joe Louis case, it seems that he was accepted quite quickly because of, well, of his nice young fellow presence. He knocked out other fighters, and he boasted not at all. And even when, for example, he had to go into the service, what reflected Joe Louis was his comment about war, who will win the war, and that's when he said, we win, we're God's on our side. And these kinds of little comments endeared himself to the American people.
How did you first hear of him? I mean, he was out in the Midwest somewhere. How did you first hear of Joe Louis?
Well, he was out there in Detroit fighting preliminaries and winning some amateur fights, which didn't put him to the forefront at all. But when they turned pro under John Roxborough, and he started knocking out everybody he met, then there was an awareness that was almost immediate. And unlike the fighters of the modern times who fought once, twice, 3 times a year, Joe Louis fought 5, 6, 7 times a month. You couldn't keep him out of the public ranks. And with his progression, undefeated as he was, he, as I say, became a presence on the scene. And then he began to fight the better fighters, Primo Carnera and Max and all those who were outstanding, and Max Schmeling at a later date, and to his great misfortune in the first fight.
We'll get on to that fight when we...
This was... the awareness of Joe Louis was a simple progression of interest in what this young black man was doing.
Great. How did the boxing establishment react to the fact that he had an all-black management team? Was that unusual at that time? That Roxborough and Blackburn and Julian Black, they were all black. Was that unusual? And how did the press and the boxing establishment react to that?
The fact that Joe Louis had an all-black coterie, a company, what you want to call it, manager, trainer, fighter, all black, seemed to have no impact whatsoever on the American people or the American press. And may I say, too, that perhaps the American press was a little more in advance of the American people in the acceptance of Joe Louis and, well, this broadly in race relation affairs. No, the fact that no white man was involved with Joe Louis was of no importance in the boxing scene.
Okay. Can you cut for a second?
Yes.
Can you tell me about the first time you saw Joe Louis fight, which fight it was, and whether he impressed you or how he impressed you?
I'm not certain which fight it was, but I know what my impressions were of Joe Louis. Joe Louis, to begin with, was, I think, the calmest fighter I ever saw. He didn't come raging out of his corner and walk across the ring and begin some assault. He simply walked out to mid-ring and stalked you for a little bit, and holding that left hand high and beginning with a little jab, and the next thing you had to wait for was that right cross that knocked everybody out. You had to see Joe Lewis's strength. I talked to one of his sparring partners. His name, I believe, was Jack McCarthy. Jack McCarthy was almost as big as Lewis, and Jack McCarthy says he's the strongest man I've ever known. He says, I've been sparring partner to so many heavyweights, and Joe Lewis would have his arms extended under my armpits and lift me off the floor with his own arms extended. That is how strong he was. And everybody knows the question, was he the hardest hitter in the history of boxing? Probably so. You had to be impressed with all of these things when you saw Joe Lewis. And the interest in him mounted.
We just ran out of time. Do you want to explain that to me? What you just explained?
In Joe Lewis's time, unlike modern days when they don't identify fighters as black or Negro or whatever they want to call them, in Joe Lewis's day there was no inhibitions about this. Press could simply call him the Doc Destroyer. They would say Joe Lewis, the Negro. And there was never any qualms about this because this got acceptance in those times that were so different. And the black fighters themselves had no great resentment about this. There was no insistence that we not be called Negro. We like to be called blacks or Afro-Americans. In the 1930s, Negroes as such were Negroes. And I recall an experience in my own office at the Washington Post where I was going in to see our managing editor. And just as a black delegation from some group had exiting his office after having visited him, and I talked to him, and he says, I've just had this delegation in here to see me, and he says, they came here with the request that when we use the word Negro, we capitalize it, a capital N, if the Washington Post pleases, we would be pleased by it. And he says, and of course I agreed to that. And then he aped Neville Chamberlain, saying, and we had peace in our time simply by agreeing to capitalize the word, capital N, and use the word Negro. These were the different times. Now, happily, nobody identifies Tyson or Holyfield as black. They're accepted as people, as fighters.
I read something in the Chris Meade book where you said something about even as in the news department, they would inquire, well, was this murder a black, was it Negroes or was it whites?
I think Chris Meade was quoting my interview with him, in which happened to be a true story, and these were the days of the 1920s when I was a police reporter for the Washington Post. And Washington was a city with a considerable number of blacks, but identified mostly as a southern town in the 20s. And I would be out on a stabbing or a murder or a killing and calling in the office, and the first thing the assistant city editor was asking me would be, white or nigger? And if I said nigger, it says, forget it. It wasn't worth printing. These were those times, and this tells you how far along the press has come.
Great. Can we cut for a second?
Yes.
Okay. So when
we talk about the prejudices, and it was wondered whether when Max Baer fought Joe Louis, or Joe Louis fought Max Baer, there was anything made of the fact that Joe Louis was black and Max Baer was Jewish, and was there any conflict here, or there any bitterness whatsoever? I would say certainly no. This was never brought into play. because in the first place, Max Baer was half Jewish and unobservant, and became Jewish when his manager suggested he wear the Star of David on his trunks, and this was the only identification he had with the Jewish people. However, in the case of Joe Louis, when he fought Max Schmeling, this was entirely different. As we know, Hitler had come on the scene, first rumble of the Nazi Holocaust, and the horrors of the new German state, and here comes Max Schmeling to fight Joe Louis. Let us remember this was not for the title, because the title was then held by Jim Braddock. So the managers of Joe Louis and Max Schmeling didn't do anything to deter this bitterness between Germans and blacks, Germans and Americans, the Nazi factor. In fact, I think they helped promote it. But I do recall that Max Schmeling coming over here, his manager denied that he was a Nazi soldier. And this little information was exploded by a friend of mine, a German fight promoter who had fled Hitler. And I asked him about Schmeling, was he a Nazi? And he said to me in very graphic terms, he's got 44 hobnails in his boots, just like every other Nazi soldier. So this established, I think, to my mind at least, the fact that this was Nazi German versus black.
Was it, excuse me for a second, was it, no, keep going. Was it Nazi German versus black or Nazi Germany versus America? Was there much made of the fact that it was a
yes,
black
I should amend that. I should say yes, it's Nazi German versus America, yes. The American people versus Nazi Hitlerism.
How was Joe seen as a representative of America?
Much was made of the fact that Joe resented Schmeling, but I think that I and virtually all others who knew Joe said that would say it didn't really make much difference to Joe. He wasn't aware of all that was being done in Germany by the Nazis, and he was not a...
But that's Joe. But what about the press and the American public? Did they make much
The
about
press-
the black man and
The press and the American public pumped up the fight. Now, in those days, the press always figured in what we call hyping fights. There were a lot of sports writers in search of a lot of topics all the time, and they would relish the idea that here was a Nazi soldier versus an American black, and they did nothing to diminish this factor. And however, the overwhelming interest was Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling. And you know what happened that night.
Right. Can you tell me about what and watch out for the scratching again. Can you tell me about your reaction and the reaction of people to that fight?
The reaction of the people as the result of that fight, in which Max Schmeling knocked out Joe Louis in the 12th round. The only man, Joe Louis had been on the floor before. If there was a criticism of Joe Louis, it could have been his chin. A few people had him on the floor. But Max Schmeling is the only one who ever kept him down. And this was probably the most surprising fight in all boxing history, the fact that Joe Louis could get hit with Schmeling's right hands. And I remember talking after the fight to people in his corner, And after the first round, when Joe Louis looked like the Joe Louis who could take Schmeling out at any point, Schmeling came back to his corner to tell his trainer, Max Schmeling, in the German idiom, he is strong. He is very strong. And Schmeling's trainer, Mehan, says, you are strong too. You can hit him too. And beginning in the third round, Schmeling, a darn good boxer, began connecting with right hands, and Joe's chin was a little vulnerable, and down he went. The upshot was he went down 3 times, and he was a thoroughly beaten fighter. And 2 things were apparent. Schmeling was underrated. Schmeling was unafraid. The second thing. And the third thing is that Joe Louis was meeting somebody who stood up to him. And this was an off night. And no great disgrace, because Jack Dempsey was beaten. Gene Tunney lost. The only fighter who ever went undefeated was Rocky Marciano, very underrated.
What about going back a fight, or a prominent fight?
We have like 20 feet left.
Okay, then we should stop.
All right.
What I was going to ask was about the Primo Carnera fight.
Why don't we go back to the other Schmeling fight?
Okay, so what about the revenge fight?
Well, you know, there had to be a rematch after what Schmeling did to Joe Louis. It took a couple of years, you know. Meantime, Jimmy Braddock wins the title. And now Joe Louis with his knockout of Braddock. And Joe Louis had to recover from a first round knockdown, reinforcing the suspicion that he sometimes had a bad chin, but he overcame it. So now they rematch Schmeling and Louis. Louis is the champion, but the specter of Schmeling knockout winner over Louis is always there. And Joe Louis is never at peace with himself until he can beat Schmeling. American people, American black people were unhappy, were completely happy with Louis as champion until he could get in the ring with Schmeling again. Well, of course, this happened. They were matched, and it was so entirely different. I think there were 2 factors there. Joe Louis wasn't going to bother to box this guy, who was a pretty good boxer himself. And I question how much enthusiasm Schmeling himself had for this fight. Because as we know, Joe Louis simply walked over across the ring into Max Schmeling's corner, belted him time and again, and knocked him down and bloodied him and devastated him. And if Schmeling could get up, it was apparent he didn't want to get up. And so Joe Louis took the short course in getting his revenge against Schmeling. No fooling around. I'm stronger than he is. I punch better than he is, and let's waste no time. And this, I think, had a great effect. This regained for Joe Louis even more popularity than he had previous to the Schmeling debacle. American people had a new great champion. The blacks had their faith in Louis as a hero restored. And what were the limits of Joe Louis? Who could say?
Great, thank you. Cut for a second.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the Carnera
Right.
thing as being a turning point.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, probably the turning point in Joe Louis's career.
Hang on a second. Can you start again because you were moving?
Yeah, probably the turning point in Joe Louis's career was when he came to New York for the Primo Carnera fight. After all, it must be realized that Joe hadn't been licking anybody of any particular importance at this point. So Joe was known as a puncher and a winner of everything he fought, but who did he ever lick? Now here comes Carnera on the scene. And Carnera, you know, came out of a circus sideshow in Italy, but he was big, and he could move, and he could punch, and unfortunately he had this lantern jaw. But he had been beating American fighters, and he was certainly recognized as a test for Joe Louis. After all, he outweighed Louis by 60 pounds, and it couldn't be said that Carnera couldn't fight. He could fight. And so there they were. This will tell you, is Joe Louis for real? Or is Carnera for real? Well, you could say that both statements were true. Carnera could fight. Joe Louis could fight better. And the first thing that he did was to attack this great big frame of Carnera, whom you could describe as bringing a big strike zone into the ring with him. And this was a great invitation to Joe. And the next thing you know, Joe was firing everything he had, lefts and right, left hook particularly, some reason that night he was using. And he had this big body, and they brought the head down, here comes the left hook. 3 times Carnera's down. Joe Louis disposed of Carnera on the American scene. Joe Louis had proved, I can beat this big guy who might have been the best of all the challengers extant at that point. I think this was probably as much the making of Joe. So dramatic, so many knockdowns about this big guy who incidentally could hit, and Joe had to take a few. But at the finish, it was Carnera going down for the last time, and his head sliding face forward on the floor like a Rogers manservant in abeyance. End of Carnera, and this is Joe Louis in our midst.
Great, thank you. Good.
Okay, take 8.
Okay, so tell me again about what Jimmy Cannon said
Yeah,
about him.
you know, Joe Louis's popularity was so wide and so great that you could almost applaud it when Jimmy Cannon, New York Post then, made the defining line about Joe Louis when he said, Joe Louis is a credit to his race, the human race. Now this is better understood and more respected when you understand that Jimmy Cannon was no great hero worshiper. And he was a cynic. And he was the same person who described boxing as, quote, the red light district of sports, unquote. So he didn't suffer villains gladly. He liked Joe Louis.
Great, thank you. All right, let's cut.
You know, when we think in terms of Joe Louis's popularity, not only among blacks, but among Americans in general, and the esteem in which he was held, perhaps it's better served to quote the line of Jimmy Cannon, then a sports writer and a fine one for the New York Post. And let us understand first that Jimmy Cannon was no great hero worshiper. In fact, Jimmy Cannon was the cynic who once wrote the remembered line about boxing, which he called, quote, boxing, the red light district of sports, unquote. This is the same chap who could and did say of Joe Louis, he's a credit to his race, the human race, unquote. And that, I think, was the most defining of all statements.
Great, thank you. Cut.
Okay.
Okay, so how did the times...
Well, you know, the 30s were simply different. America had going through its own depression as well, and times were bad for everybody, and particularly, I'm sure, bad for the blacks. And there was no progress. The blacks were still reduced to the menial trades. The boot blacks, every boot black you saw was a black, and they worked only in the service trades. And the Depression was a burden, particularly for them. But the prejudices were alive as well, and maybe even more so. And it was anti-Semitism was in the air of this time. Hitler didn't invent it. It was there even if below the surface. The contrast is that anti-black prejudices were on the surface, and none could escape them. But these were the times in which Joe Louis came along. And as I say, he was regarded as a nice young Negro boy who didn't pose any threat to anybody. He was not abrasive, he was not aggressive, and he won easy acceptance together with his fists. You don't win his fights. Joe Louis is just some black kid who belongs who belongs in the low-paid job or whatever he happens to be. But I think the fact that he came along at this time in the manner that he could present as the simple, black, honest kid helped to break down this wall of prejudice.
We just ran out of film. Can we... Okay, so picking up again what you said, so here along comes the
Well,
black kid and how it...
as you know, America was still enveloped in the effects of the Depression when Joe Louis came along. And after 1932, when President Roosevelt was embarked on all these welfare programs, now I'm not sure that it reached the blacks, penetrated in the same degree it did the whites. So everybody was having a bad time. And it was at this time when Joe Louis came along, a black fighter, Negro fighter, making all this progress, beating all these guys, even threatening to be a champion, heaven forbid in the eyes of so many whites, yet he began to neutralize all of this anti-black feeling with his own deportment. He was regarded as a simple, honest, good Negro who could punch like hell and who had given people so much to admire in the terms of prize fighting. He was becoming one great prize fighter, and he got an acceptance that was relatively speedy in terms of race relations. And this, I think, was his great contribution to integration and the equality that it carries, even if he was never aware or greatly motivated by the thought of it.
Great, thank you. Now, you talked a little bit before about anti-Semitism. What how did anti-Semitism manifest itself at that time in America? Not so much in Nazi Germany, but
Well, I'm not sure I could be an authority on anti-Semitism.
well, in you personally.
But I would suggest anti-Semitism was always there. It wasn't quite as obvious as anti-black prejudices, but it was there a little bit subsurface all the time, and particularly among those rednecks who didn't like the blacks, that neither did they like the Jews, you know, and I'm sure that there were, same could be said of a certain segment of Middle America and WASPs, and I think that the Jewish people had this to combat all the time.
Do you have any personal stories of
Well,
anything?
perhaps I shouldn't talk. I couldn't talk authoritatively in a sense of my own experiences. I was growing up in a small town with only 4 Jewish families in Bahama, Maine. There was no sense of anti-Semitism that we were aware of. We knew who we were at home. Our parents told us who we were.
What about in the 30s? You have to stop. We have the phone ringing.
We talk about anti-Semitism in the 1930s. I'm probably a poor authority in the sense that I'm already sports editor of a large metropolitan newspaper. And here I am in a position in which, let's face it, I'm not seeking anything from anybody, but a great many people are seeking things from the sports editor of the Washington Post, whether they want publicity or favors of some kind, so I'm on the receiving end. And the anti-Semitism there was so subliminal, I couldn't say that there was a great deal. I wasn't on the other side of the fence trying to make progress and handicapped by what the anti-Semitism that went on. But I do remember Washington in the 1930s and the great breakthrough when Mary Anderson, whatever her name.
Why don't you start again? It's Marian Anderson.
Marian. I do remember the great breakthrough in the 1930s when Marian Anderson, after being denied entry to the daughter DAR Hall to perform, was finally invited there at the insistence of Eleanor Roosevelt, and delivered her great concert, which made everybody so very happy, with the exception of those dedicated bigots. And this was a memorable event. I contrast it with an earlier event at the DAR Hall, Daughters of American Revolution Hall, in the 1920s, when I was covering police, and we get a riot call, DAR, but it wasn't the DAR, it was the Daughters of the Confederacy meeting there, and they were embroiled in some heated discussion, and there seemed to be